Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicholas Phillips. Today, we're talking about adapting during a pandemic, removing barriers for individuals with disabilities. This is part of our series on New York State of Health, and we offer a citizen public health leader training program. We'll put a link in the chat for additional material on where you can find that information. Well, the COVID-19 pandemic has had an immense physical and mental toll on people living with disabilities. Not only are those with disabilities at higher risks for severe COVID-19 outcomes, but they also face barriers that increase isolation, limit access to basic needs, and often lead them to postpone treatment or rehabilitation. Now, for people whose disabilities make it difficult to communicate, the pandemic is correlated with mental, emotional, and physical decline. In this session, occupational therapist and educator Vikram Pagbatan will discuss some of those barriers and their effects on the quality of life for individuals living with disabilities. We'll also explore how the pandemic has impacted the communication style, capabilities, access to resources, digital social etiquette, and social boundaries of people with disabilities. But some of the questions we'll help answer include how the use of face coverings like masks and other COVID-19 restrictions impact social communication and quality of life for those living with disabilities, and strategies for addressing and enhancing the quality of life during the COVID-19 pandemic for people with disabilities. Now, this is being recorded and will be available following our conversation, but it's not just me and Vikram. We want you to join us in this conversation. We'll be fielding in some of your questions throughout, so please submit those questions, comments, feedback, stories, anything like that in the chat. We'll be answering those kind of throughout our session today, so please feel free to open that chat up whenever you'd like. But enough about me, the reason why we're all here. Let me introduce Professor Vikram Pagbatan. He's a licensed occupational therapist in New York City. He's also an assistant professor of admissions coordinator for SUNY Downstate's occupational therapy program. He's a certified autism specialist and board telepractice specialist, experienced with the rehabilitative application of technology within clinical practices. His research focuses on how the pandemic has impacted the mental health and well-being of New Yorkers, and how specific socio-cultural factors and disparities influence individuals' decisions, overall health and wellness in relation with cardiovascular and cardiopulmonary health. Born and raised in Queens, Professor Pagbatan is an Indian American and proud New Yorker. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you for a great introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending my presentation. I would like to thank eCornell and their amazing team for implementing such an outstanding collection of educational tools for public access and viewing. They're doing a great service for us all. And again, the more transparent our content and the more transparent information can be, it's the better for everyone. My name again is Vikram Pagbatan. I'm a licensed occupational therapist in New York City. I'm also a full-time professor at SUNY Downstate's occupational therapy program. I'm excited to present on this very important topic and have a very real discussion on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic towards individuals with disabilities. This is a near and dear topic to my heart as a practicing occupational therapist, as well as an educator in preparing the next wave of healthcare practitioners in addressing this growing need, especially in our hometown of New York City. Okay. With that said, I would like to start and proceed to slide 2, our session objectives. Today, we will discuss the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic towards individuals with a diverse set of disabilities. The term disability will be used to identify a deficit, a hardship, a medical condition, and/or a form of burden that an individual or a group of individuals may be experiencing. Next, we will seek to discuss how the impact of the pandemic has affected areas of communication and expression, access to resources, and quality of life, as well as the growing need of technology literacy as we have quickly transitioned to a mostly digitized society for various reasons. Lastly, we will have discussion on how we can address some of these challenges head on and put in place strategies to prevent further health issues for those with existing disabilities. We're now on slide 3, and by the way, I will just kind of call out the slides as we kind of progress forward, just so we can kind of stay on track together. So we're now on slide 3. There'll be various discussion terms that we'll use throughout the presentation. These terms are occupational roles, which identify the various roles an individual can assume on a daily basis throughout their lives. This can be of a student, an employee, a parent, an educator, and or a patient, for example. We will also discuss how the use of face masks or face coverings has presented with various challenges for an array of individuals with existing disabilities, such as those living with arthritis, Parkinson's disease, dementia or Alzheimer's, and individuals within the autism spectrum disorders, and individuals with speech issues as well. This presentation will also highlight the global mental health pandemic as a result of the coronavirus outbreak, and what we as engaged individuals can do to help slow down the wave of secondary issues. Lastly, I would like the presentation to deeply discuss the important role of caregivers towards individuals with disabilities and how caregiver support is an essential component in combating the various challenges that we all face in some form in today's climate. So we're now on slide 4. Barriers and obstacles have always existed for individuals living with disabilities, and in many cases, access to equitable forms of resources have been scarce when the conversation and or agenda often underrepresents populations of individuals who may not always be heard. According to recent sources, individuals aged 65 and over have accounted for 80% of the US COVID-19 related deaths. This population also represents over 40% of individuals classified as having a serious disability that either limits mobility, vision, memory, hearing, and or impairments that severely limit independence in day-to-day activities. Furthermore, social determinants of health, such as where you live, occupation or employment, educational status, access to food or food security, and economic stability and consistency can all influence the risk and infection, can all influence the risk of infection and possible transmission of the COVID-19 virus. These factors also greatly impact individuals living with disabilities and those rendering their care. We're now on slide 5. There are various high-risk populations, according to the CDC. Individuals with cardiac and cardiopulmonary conditions are one of them. According to health.ny.gov, asthma rates in the 5 boroughs is higher than the rest of the state for kids and teens, whereas rates of diagnosed asthmatic conditions for adults is significantly higher in denser urban populations, such as those who reside in Bronx or in Brooklyn or even Queens as well. Other conditions, such as developmental disabilities, are also categorized as high-risk populations. This classification accounts for a large majority of students within the special education system or sector of the New York City Department of Education. And in general, adults with developmental disabilities account for a large portion of the New York City population. According to the Centers for Independence for the Disabled, in New York, adults residing in New York City with a developmental disability account for nearly 11% of the total population. Other populations, such as those with mobility impairments, those who utilize wheelchairs, scooters, or possibly even ambulatory canes, also represent an at-risk population for contracting and spreading the coronavirus. As a therapist, a large majority of my patients fit into multiple categories listed here, and these clients continue to face various hardships in access, communication, and primary and follow-up care as seen within the pandemic. As a home care therapist, I have painstakingly seen this pandemic create an almost age-in-place situation whereby individuals with disabilities are trapped within their homes, unable to gain access or appropriate allocation to basic services and resources. I'm really curious. Please input your thoughts into the chat box if you share or have experienced a similar sentiment where you have witnessed individuals with either mobility impairments or individuals with developmental disabilities that have just out of fear or out of a lack of resources have aged in place and are not re-engaging within the community. And that's a growing concern for us all as concerned citizens, family members, educators, and human beings. We are now on slide 6. From the front lines is sometimes a very surreal statement. We often think about our healthcare heroes as those who often take the front lines without hesitation in defending our health and wellness throughout the entire extent of this pandemic. But we also need to take a deeper look at those at the front lines, and specifically those individuals with disabilities who often encounter the initial wave of obstacles and challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic. Individuals with decreased stamina and endurance, and those who encounter periods of confusion or altered mental states, experience a difficult time in processing information in a safe and efficient manner as compared to those who are less affected. Remembering to socially distance, to wash and sanitize our hands often, and to exercise basic rules of protection, such as wearing masks, can be monumental tasks for individuals with dementia or Alzheimer's, and those with cardiac conditions, such as hypertension or high blood pressure, or even congestive heart failure, where the simplest task can take 3 or 4 times as much time as compared to someone who doesn't have that same condition. Furthermore, joint pain and difficulty breathing are all too common symptoms for many individuals with certain occupations and with a certain history of medical conditions such as obesity, both for young kids such as pediatrics and for adults. The use of certain types of face coverings The use of certain types of face coverings often restricts the flow of respirations and can create a near panic attack experience for those with existing respiratory issues. A recent patient of mine had a long-standing history of sleep apnea, whereby the use of a daily face mask had only increased their fatigue and resulted in a dramatic drop in their energy levels and their ability to engage in their day-to-day tasks or the tasks that they found meaningful. So as friends, patients, educators, business owners, clinicians, and as concerned citizens, we can take simple measures such as modifying the environment by creating open, unobstructed spaces, creating an open area of ventilation or access to open ventilation. And often we need to monitor and observe any changes of distress or any signs that can result in a possible emergency medical situation at all times, especially now with the change in weather and within the change of restrictions. So again, as today being a very humid day in New York City, it's another risk factor for many individuals living with disabilities. And again, wearing a face mask can only limit their energy levels as we continue forward into summer, right? As all New Yorkers know. We are now on slide 7. Let's take an occupational therapy look at the front lines for those individuals with disabilities, and let's try to work around some of these barriers, yeah? Applying a face mask may take seconds for most, but experiencing difficulty in remembering the sequence of having to put on a face mask, having involuntary movements of the hands, and also having a difficult time in remembering the orientation of a face mask can make this very daily task extremely difficult and much more monumental in terms of applicability and efficiency. In addition to wearing a face mask, expressive communication can sometimes be difficult. Speaking through a face mask often sounds muffled with a low pitch. Having difficulty in hearing as a medical condition, or even impairments in sight, such as glaucoma or cataracts, can definitely make this form of communication even much more difficult. It makes comprehension and expression of communication much more difficult when wearing a mask, even in a very common situation, such as talking to a loved one or talking to a friend. Overall, the situation has been reported by many individuals as unnerving and extremely uncomfortable in terms of having a low sense of self-esteem and a low sense of dignity when you're unable to either understand or express communication. Lastly, with an individual with any disability and any form of societal standpoint, there's a presence of stigma and inequity which is all too common, and even much more for those who have to function on a daily basis with others. During the pandemic, individuals with disabilities often lack the access or allocation of basic resources, and the scarcity of such resources only inhibited many with existing disabilities to often resort to their own means of support, often with clear disadvantages and negative outcomes towards their health and well-being. Individuals who were unable to gain appropriate face coverings fabricated their own. And in many situations, those fabricated face masks often limited communication efficiency or even the expression of thoughts, needs, ideas, and wants. So for individuals living with disabilities, there is a huge disadvantage to the equitable form of access to resources. Not everyone can use Amazon. Not everyone can order something online. So it's not a given across the board, people, right? So it's especially not a given for older adults as well. We are now on slide 8. It's often difficult to discuss the experiences of individuals with disabilities and not shed light into those rendering their care, offering support and acting as their advocates within society and in life. According to research conducted by Park in 2021, caregiver fatigue, and sometimes called compassion fatigue, as it's sometimes referred to within the medical community, is a highly prevalent incident during the current pandemic. Caregiver fatigue, or feeling burnt out, is a very common phenomenon whereby individuals who provide any form of primary care often feel mentally, physically, and emotionally fatigued in many respects. Whether you're a parent, son, daughter, sibling, partner, or a medical provider, the likelihood of experiencing fatigue from a physical, mental, or emotional state is very high during the pandemic. Recognizing and prioritizing your own health is a top priority when addressing the needs of others. Identifying the triggers of your fatigue, addressing and discussing those variables with a loved one, a friend, or a medical provider is a right step in addressing these concerns head on. Developing coping and resiliency strategies often helps as well. Do what makes you feel good and ensure that you allocate enough time for yourself in any form when rendering care to those in need. Lastly, staying connected is a driving factor to building support, fostering trust, and to feel your health and well-being in the right direction through a community-centered model. There's nothing wrong with asking for help, especially when addressing the care of someone else all by yourself or with limited supports. Again, the state of health for both the individual with a disability and the caregiver is both a priority. They're equally as important. One does not outweigh the other. So if you're not able to take care of yourself, you're probably less likely to take care of someone with a disability, right? Alrighty, we are now on slide 9. Just as an interesting note from slide 8, in terms of taking care of yourself or allocating some type of resource for your own mental, physical, or basic health need, I enjoy walking my dog. My dog is a very large dog, and he requires many walks throughout the day. When I'm walking my dog, I like to listen to music. And that's my way of mentally just de-escalating my emotions and stress levels. I would love to hear your own. I mean, during the pandemic, I know we've been limited in terms of what we can access and do within multiple contexts. But I would love to kind of, share your experiences and hear your experiences in terms of what you feel as a caregiver works for you. Who knows, you might even inspire someone else. So definitely input those into the chat box if you're able to. Now on slide 9, according to Van Hooven from a study in 2020, we need to acknowledge, value, and account for the experiences of caregivers in addressing the impact of the coronavirus towards public health. The lack of input from certain populations has clearly shed a bright and persistent spotlight into our nation's inequalities and inequities in skewed representation of representative authorities when making very public pertinent decisions. Caregivers are huge stakeholders for individuals with disabilities. So to not account for their opinions when making public policies or to not account for their experiences is extremely sad, especially within New York City, where, again, we have a large population of individuals in need. And caregivers, by the way, and I do apologize if I didn't mention this before, caregivers are not just loved ones. They're family, they're friends, they're medical providers. They're your neighbors that can keep an eye, on you or someone you love from a distance. It doesn't have to be direct primary care. A caregiver, in essence, is a gatekeeper or an overwatcher of someone. And in any form of support that's needed, that's the job of a caregiver. So again, to not account for their opinions is a huge disparity within our public policy. And according to the study, we have a long way to go in making sure there's equal representation of all individuals involved from a COVID-19 perspective. Alrighty, folks, we're now on slide 10. Going back to the example of face masks and face coverings from an application standpoint, we often view communication as a reciprocal activity involving the comprehension and expression of oral speech or verbal speech. What we don't account for is when speech needs to be supplemented by facial.
They are. Those are my thoughts. I said, I think.
When speech needs to be supplemented by facial gestures, emotions, nonverbal forms of communication, and such as body movements and even accents and tone is a part of speech that may.
That's because we're old school. That's the way.
So, sorry, I'm going to start the slide over. We're now on slide 10. So going back to the example of face masks and face coverings from an application standpoint, we often view communication as a reciprocal activity involving the comprehension and expression of oral speech. What we don't often account for is when speech needs to be supplemented by facial gestures, emotions, and nonverbal forms of speech and communication, such as body movements, accents, pitch, and tone. A current patient of mine who identified English as a second language often experienced varying forms of discrimination based upon his disability and inability to confidently convey his thoughts, ideas, and needs while wearing a face mask. So to put this into perspective, right now we're having a communication back and forth. It's reciprocal. You guys are listening to me. You guys are seeing my facial expressions, my gestures, my emotions, and so forth. When over 60% of your face is covered by a mask, there are many individuals with disabilities that need that extra level of communication from you in order to account for just overall interpretation of the spoken word. So if I'm not able to see your lips, if I'm not able to see your emotions, if I can't see your eyebrows, or if I can't even see your cheeks move up and down, I may misinterpret basic speech. And that's very common for individuals on the spectrum who might have autism disorder. And it's extremely common for individuals with traumatic brain injuries, such as those who have suffered motor vehicle accidents or open or closed head injuries. So we have to be cognizant of the way that we convey our speech and sometimes take a deep breath and slow down. And that often really helps in terms of reassuring that comprehension is accurate, especially from, again, a friend, consumer, educator, loved one perspective, right? Because face mask wasn't a part of our daily routines a couple of years ago. So it's now more than ever. We're now on slide 11. Moving forward with this visual representation, we often view our daily lives in a set of categories that define our unique roles and contributions within society. From an occupational therapy lens, which is my profession, individuals are made up of distinct values. Values, beliefs, and unique forms of spirituality that can make up their own occupational identities. Our mental health, in many ways, the ways that we cope with obstacles and hardships, and even the way we define health and wellness are shaped by our individualized experiences and the many hats we wear on a day-to-day basis. From the lens of an individual with a disability, the current pandemic has definitely stripped even the basic forms of independence of quality of life. As educators, friends, family members, concerned citizens, and clinicians, we often need to take a minute to step back and take a deeper look into the holistic state of an individual, accounting for not just their obvious need, but also the hidden needs, the things that we can't see that often get masked by the current climate. There are many patients that I have encountered over the past year that have had what I call, again, hidden needs or hidden concerns that have been, again, masked by things that individuals often prioritize as not important or just not worthy of a topic or discussion. Within the COVID-19 pandemic, there's a huge umbrella that's over our other needs and our other concerns. But again, basic priority states that you socially distant, you follow CDC guidelines, and you remain as healthy as possible. But our health doesn't stop, right? Our health is dynamic. And as individuals, we often need to take a much more broader perspective into looking at health. How do we define health? Are you healthy, and in what ways? How are you unhealthy, and is it that obvious for someone to see? So these questions have to be asked from a very holistic model of interpretation. So again, as friends, caregivers, and clinicians, we need to take a minute to really understand who the person is, whether it's a friend or a patient, and ask as many pertinent questions that are not as obvious as the problem in front of you. We're now on slide 12. Feelings of social connectedness is everywhere, from social media technologies to the rapid assimilation of telehealth or teleconferencing technologies. An important aspect of individuals with disabilities is to access and discuss their technology literacy and comfort levels. Technology is an enabler. We know this for sure. But technology as an enabler is quite common, but a lack of access, competency, or knowledge on how to use technology is definitely a form of a disparity or inequity when it comes to individuals with disabilities. So from an open playing field, technology literacy is not a given. Technology access is not a given. As an educator in a state institution, many of my students often did not have the appropriate means of educational technology for remote learning. And it should not be a given where, oh, you should have a web camera, or you should have constant or consistent Wi-Fi access, right? It's just, it's a very inequitable way of thinking. And that's the same for individuals with disabilities. From medical issues to emotional issues to even psychosocial issues, technology can be overwhelming, and technology is ever dynamic. So to keep up with technology, it requires a lot of work, even for an individual who's been exposed or uses technology on a daily basis. So again, as educators, friends, family members, and clinicians, we have to account for the individuals with a disability and their technology literacy levels. Take a minute to explain how technology works. Take a minute to assess their competency and their confidence levels when using technology. And if support is not available, then sometimes try to avoid the use of technology altogether. It can't just be a cookie cutter perspective into delivering treatment that a patient should be able to gain online access to their health portals, for example, when they don't even have an email, for example, right? So again, just taking into a very equitable form, technology literacy is not a given. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's really forced us to say, well, how do we teach technology literacy first, right? Not only from an academic perspective, but from a social perspective. We're now on slide 13 to discuss the topic of individual disabilities within the climate of COVID, and not to discuss the ever-growing mental health pandemic that we're currently facing would be an injustice to the discussion in this afternoon. According to the CDC, mental health conditions are disproportionately affecting specific populations, and the ever-growing challenges within the social and health disparities continue to rise for those with diagnosed mental illnesses. Rates of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and suicidal ideations have all increased since early 2020 and with the start of the pandemic in the United States. From my clinical experience as an occupational therapist, the most powerful tool when working with the medically compromised population is to actively listen to what they're saying and not saying. So I hope that makes sense, guys, is to actively listen to what they're saying and to notice the signs of what they're not saying is a huge step one that I teach most of my students when entering the field of healthcare or entering the field of rehabilitation. Symptoms of anxiety and depression are very common with individuals with existing disabilities and often translate to a lack of enjoyment, sedentary lifestyles, and or preoccupations with triggers of stress and panic. Has anyone watched the news recently? Does the news or does any type of social media post sometimes trigger this feeling of wrath or chaos or feeling of non-control? I know it does for me. I would love to hear your opinions as well. Do you sometimes feel the onslaught of information coming from multiple sources can sometimes have a detrimental effect into your inner peace, what I call inner peace in many situations? For me, it causes definitely panic and stress and anxiety. So could you imagine what it causes individuals with disabilities, who, again, who are often worried about real issues, such as access, communication, and resources. We need to be cognizant of all signs of mental illness, even when we don't suspect them for the ones closest to us. So these are some stats from the CDC. Again, there have been rises in many conditions. And what's really important to note is that individuals with schizophrenia, a form of psychosis, according to the DSM-5 of disorders, is nearly 10 times more likely in individuals with schizophrenia to contract COVID-19 than those who without schizophrenia. And this is for many reasons, but again, it sheds light into the dynamic process of having a mental illness and still being a user or a participant in societal activities, right? So a severe psychosis such as schizophrenia can definitely have a negative impact when contracting and transmitting and living with COVID-19. We're now on slide 14. This is a quick visual representation of highlighting important statistics in the rates of anxiety and depressive disorders, respectively amongst adults. And there's definitely been a huge increase from 2019 to 2021 with recent data coming in. What's interesting to note from this representation is that adults aged 18 to 24 have reported higher symptoms with anxiety and depression versus aged adults 65 and over. What's really, really interesting about this scenario is that if you often look at the ages of caregivers, caregivers are often younger than those that they're rendering care for. So if you think about the demographic populations of individuals between 18 to 24, 25 to 49, or even 50 to 64, these are individuals that are rendering care for individuals who have compromised medical states. So it's an alarming statistic to note that we're all in the pot. We all have issues. And again, addressing our health first can only make the outcomes better for the ones that we're caring for. Alrighty, we are on slide 15. Suicidal ideations and signs of distress have increased since the start of the pandemic. Economic stress as a result of a lack of employment has increased suicidal ideations. Social isolations associated with suicidal thoughts because of social distancing has increased the rate of suicidal ideations. And by the way, I'm sorry, suicidal ideations are just even the thoughts of committing suicide or self-harm. Very different than homicidal ideations, which is harm towards others. Furthermore, participation in religious communities is associated with lower suicide rates. However, churches and community centers have also been forced to close for appropriate means due to social isolation and have increased the rates of suicide. So again, not having access to an individual's means of coping or even spiritual meditation has definitely caused, again, a lack of resources, a lack of available resources, and even a lack of support in many situations. Furthermore, continuous media coverage of the pandemic may intensify anxiety and the fear for individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions. So from Facebook to Instagram to news feeds to YouTube, we are a society with full access to information at all times, very opinionated, sometimes very subjective, sometimes very objective forms of information. But for individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions, this can definitely intensify symptoms, especially symptoms of fear, panic, and stress, which may exacerbate risk of suicidal ideations and distress. All right, we are now on slide 16. I want to take the remaining time and discuss case studies that I feel might be relatable to many of you in regards to as either being caregivers, patients, clinicians, friends, family members, students, and so forth. I'm going to talk about certain individuals from these case studies. These are patients of mine. Obviously, the images are not real, but the information is very close to being real. And I would love to hear your opinion as well in the chat box. So do you know Javier? He's a 48-year-old male husband. He's a warehouse employee in Queens, New York. He has a medical history of low back pain. I know I do. I know a lot of individuals have low back pain, especially now with the pandemic and sitting all day. And he has a fluency disorder, specifically stuttering. Now, stuttering is very common in adults. We often think about stuttering as just a very common speech disorder within pediatrics, but it is very common within adults as well. English is his second language with partial fluency and expression and comprehension. So he's comfortable with English, but not fully, not 100%. He gets very nervous and anxious when having to communicate with a face mask or a face covering. Now, does this seem like a real situation? Absolutely. When wearing a face mask or face covering, it not only limits your ability to comprehend speech, but it definitely limits your confidence in expressing speech. When having a stuttering disorder, you have to be patient. Or when dealing with anyone with a speech disorder, as again, a friend, clinician, educator, whoever you are, active listening and allowing or allocating enough time for them to comfortably express their needs is a huge plus. So for having any type of speech disorder, you have to give them time. And you have to think about the dynamic context that you're having a conversation in. If it's outside in Queens, for example, in Jackson Heights, in a very busy, crowded street, they might not feel comfortable, or they might feel rushed when expressing speech, especially when having a fluency disorder. So looking at this situation, we have to be cognizant of the environment where speech is being conveyed. And that's the point of Javier. We are now on slide 17. Do you know Hussein? Hussein is a 50-year-old male with a diagnosis of Parkinson's disorder, which is a neurological disorder which causes involuntary movements of the hand and other parts of the body. So it often looks like this. Common individuals, celebrity individuals who have had Parkinson's or have Parkinson's would include Muhammad Ali and Michael J. Fox, if you guys know those individuals. So that's Parkinson's disorder. He also has a major history of major depression. This is Hussein, by the way. He resides in a first-floor apartment with his wife and college-age child. He's employed as a building maintenance worker. He is extremely self-conscious about his shaking hands, is what he calls it, when performing work-related tasks. Now, this individual has to wash and sanitize his hands often, and this individual often has to go into other individuals' apartments in this building and kind of, do repairs and make calls and so forth. While having Parkinson's disorder and having a delayed movement disorder where everything is a little bit more delayed and slow in terms of initiation of movement, and also having involuntary movements of the hand, this makes Hussein's job very difficult in performing it confidently and also kind of enticing or fostering confidence from his tenants. His shaking hands also makes it very difficult to put on a face mask. In many cases, his face covering falls off of his face or gets dislodged whenever he makes a sudden movement. In this situation, the time that it takes Hussein to put on his face mask is very long. And in this situation, again, having a disability, we have to be quite cognizant that putting on a face mask or face covering is at itself a task. It's not something that we all do from a subconscious state or in a very quick state. So for having a disability that affects movement, many of my patients have reported, putting on a face mask, a particular type of face mask can take 15 to 30 minutes at a time. And again, how fixed are these masks, or how static are they when they're on our faces? Not often, correct? Sometimes perspiration or sudden movements or even what we say can always dislodge the face mask. So again, being cognizant of individuals who might need extra support or extra time to put on face coverings for communication is quite important. We're now on slide 18. Do you know Cynthia? Cynthia is a 10-year-old female with a congenital diagnosis of Down syndrome and resides in the Bronx, New York. She resides at home with her parents and her older brother. She's had a difficult time with remote learning, making new friends, and with sanitizing and washing her hands when in public. Cynthia hates the sensation of water in her hands, and she definitely hates the sensation of hand sanitizer, which, has a very interesting feel to it, right? It's not just water, but it's something else. So Cynthia, having Down syndrome, is very self-conscious about her appearance and very self-conscious about her intelligence level. She doesn't feel that remote learning is suitable for her educational needs. And ever since the pandemic started, Cynthia's parents have had a hard time understanding how to really adapt the academic environment for Cynthia's needs. Now, looking at this situation, this is a very common example that many parents might be able to relate to. Adapting barriers is easier said than done, especially when it comes to pediatrics or children. Cynthia is very resilient, But Cynthia definitely needs the attention from the educator, from the administrator, from her parents, and even her friends to really understand how to modify the learning environment from home to simulate what she would get in school. So again, looking at the situation, an individual with an existing disability, we have to be able to really employ a universal approach in understanding how we take technology and implant it or generalize it to the general public, right? It's not a one size fit all type of persona in this situation. So in Cynthia's case, she has her resiliency factors, but she definitely needs the support and attention to use technology within the climate of the pandemic in an equitable means, or an equitable fashion. All right, we're now on slide 19. Do you know Michael? Michael's a 24-year-old male with a history of substance abuse and generalized anxiety disorder. He resides in a college dorm in Manhattan and has limited social supports. Recently, he's been feeling isolated, stressed, and has stated that he's unworthy of life. Now, going back to our discussion on suicidal ideations or suicidal thoughts, individuals with disabilities often account for a large percentage of individuals who have actually executed suicide. Many individuals have suicidal ideations and thoughts, but the actual execution of a suicide proportionally is higher for individuals with disabilities. Now, Michael, being a young individual, college student, feeling very isolated and feeling very disconnected from his support systems, is stressed out. And he's stating that life is not worth it, or he's unworthy of life. Now, a statement like that said to a friend, or a statement like that sent to a medical provider, must be taken seriously. Any type of suicidal ideations, any type of signs, any type of deviations from their normal routine, it has to be reported up the chain, whether it's to the parent, whether it's to the administrator, it's to Michael's professors, it's to Michael's dean, it's to his primary care provider, anyone. So the main huge mistake that we make as individuals, as clinicians, as parents, as friends, is that we keep information to ourselves in hopes of not creating a scene or making a big deal. Truth be told, as a clinician, I often overreact versus underreacting to any type of signs that seem a little off, right? So especially within the climate, especially within the COVID-19 climate, it's important to understand that these signs might be invisible and they're not as outright as a statement of unworthy of life. So the notion from this slide, guys, is that what does the MTA say in New York City? If you see something, say something. Please take that and apply it to all facets of life, especially when being a support pillar for an individual, right? Whether a medical provider, a clinician, or an educator, and so forth. Alrighty, Nick, we're good on time, right? We're good on time.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Great,
okay.
on time.
Perfect. We're now on slide 20. So wrapping up this PowerPoint presentation, now we've talked about a lot of issues. We've talked about obstacles. Now kind of let's get into what may work. And again, these are just recommendations. They're definitely open for adaptation and modification. This is not a protocol on dealing with issues. This is a template or a foundation to build upon. So in slide 20, let's look at strategies in addressing the quality of life factor for individual with disabilities from an occupational therapy perspective. You have to address feelings of isolation. Everyone definitely, to some form, definitely feels isolated, whether it's from loved ones, whether it's from your work, whether it's from Walmart or Target, in any fashion. Isolation can always translate to an increased level of stress and fatigue. So addressing feelings of isolation is definitely a priority. How do you address it? It can be in many ways. It could just even be as simple as a contextual variation. Going out to make a phone call versus staying at your home, getting as much outdoor time as possible, even fluctuating where you work within your home. I know many individuals have home offices. Sometimes it's great to have a dynamic home office that you can take to different parts of your home, just to kind of create more variability and different ways of experiencing your home in terms of context. Expanding on self-development, spirituality, and alternative forms of communication. Staying connected is huge. Again, with technology and access to different forms of teleconferencing tools, using video conferencing tools to stay connected is a great way to kind of increase your moral support and also to increase your emotional health. So staying connected, in many situations, I often tell my pediatric clients that texting and using emojis is not always the healthiest form of consistent communication. Have a conversation, pick up your phone and speak to someone. It takes longer, but it's much more worth it than just having indirect communications, right? Such as texting and using social media platforms. That's just my snippet, but definitely have oral communication, right? It's extremely healthy and it's very emotional at the same time, right? It's a real LOL versus something that's texted. Monitoring and acknowledging those in your space, prioritizing a dedicated self space within your home context, discussion of time management, limiting technology dependency is quite huge from an occupational therapy perspective. In many situations, technology over-dependency can definitely have detrimental effects in terms of your health. We often perseverate. We often create these structured routines where we have to have access to technology at all times. And guess what? When we don't have technology, or when the Wi-Fi goes out, or when your computer shuts down, it can cause this unrest feeling of nervousness and panic and anxiety. And that's sometimes worse as well, because we don't have coping mechanisms when we don't have technology. So when we don't have technology, that definitely can cause issues in terms of mental health for a very long period of time. Routine physical exercise, the CDC states, and many other credible sources states that aerobic exercises are great for addressing physical health, especially during the climate of pandemic. Any type of diaphragmatic breathing, deep breathing, pelvic base exercises, and routine non-resistive movement. So not dumbbells, but just overall cardiac and anaerobic and aerobic exercises are great for maintaining health, especially when looking at tidal volume of the lungs. So the more you can breathe, the easier it is for you to breathe, inhale and exhale, the stronger your body is in terms of accounting for both cardiac and respiratory health. Right, so breathing or deep breathing or meditation are great ways in addressing or hopefully slowing down the effects of COVID in general, according to credible sources, of course. From a sociocultural perspective, we are now on slide 21. From a sociocultural perspective, the COVID-19 pandemic has almost opened up a Pandora's box of other issues in our country's climate, systematic racism, intersectionality, inequities against individual disabilities. We often look at the COVID-19 pandemic as a starting point of a lot of areas of improvement for our nation, and especially within New York City. As diversified as we are, there are a lot of areas of segregation and a lot of inequities when it comes to the allocation of resources, even the information or conveying information to certain populations. Also, the form in which it's conveyed. In many situations, a lot of communities, a lot of zip codes have access to just the basic form of information, whereas other zip codes and other communities have a plethora of information available to them, whether it's from universities, business owners, medical providers, hospital institutions, and so forth. So the conversation really here is why is that, and what can we do to close the gap? My personal opinion is to educate ourselves, with credible sources, reliable sources of information, and definitely to spread information. Don't keep it to yourself. Have discussions with loved ones, have discussions with community members, have discussions with your congressmen and women, and think about advocacy for your community, but also think about advocacy for your communities and populations. I come from a very Indian American community in Queens, New York. And again, with culture and values, they sometimes play a huge role in the interpretation of information. Right? Sometimes very, very speculation, sometimes a lot of superstition type behaviors. And that sometimes is not appropriate because it's very contagious. So my main gist is, as I said before, information can be subjective or information can be objective. Look at the hard facts and look at the data. If you're unsure if something is credible, ask someone, and definitely ask your medical providers. And if they're not sure, tell them to ask someone. Go up the chain. Don't stop there, right? That's their job, to serve you and provide you information. So from a sociocultural perspective, we often just limit ourselves to our micro bubbles and our microsystems, and that's not good, especially from a public health perspective. All right, we're now on slide 22. From a caregiver-centered discussion, as stated before, the most powerful tool that I have within my toolkit when working with patients in their homes or working with patients in the hospital is to actively listen. It's sometimes we are in a conveying, we're in a robotic form, almost like like a conveyor belt of movement and operation from our day-to-day activities, right? In terms of what we do for professionally or what we do personally. So to take a minute to actively listen is the use of a great interpersonal skill that sometimes takes a little bit of practice to do. But to actively listen is to reassure and reconfirm that you're there for them, from both a caregiver perspective or even from a clinician perspective. Acknowledging signs of distress, routine monitoring, addressing both physical, emotional, spiritual, and their psychosocial health. Psychosocial health, by the way, is the combination of emotional and behavioral health. How an individual reacts to a trigger, how an individual reacts to a stressful situation is what is termed as psychosocial health. Encouraging daily exercise, diversifying daily experiences, and the leveraging technology. Again, technology is a great asset for society, but to leverage technology carefully can be much more beneficial to individuals with disabilities. So leveraging technology as a means of a resource, not as a means of a luxury or leisurely resource. All right, we're now on slide 23. From a theoretical perspective, and I believe this is the last slide, from a theoretical perspective, as an occupational therapist, I employ all forms of evidence-based practice. And in my head, when I encounter a client or a patient, I have to account for all variables that's in front of me, not just the obvious concern. So if the obvious concern is abdominal pain, or, hey, I'm Vic and I have a headache. Well, why do you have a headache? What happened to you before you had a headache? What were you doing before you? I mean, all these questions, it's almost like a 15, 20-minute conversation, but all these questions I don't ask, they're in my head, what I call clinical reasoning. So there's a model called the model of human occupation. It describes the inherent characteristics of an individual's life, occupations or their roles, meaning the father, mother, sibling, and so forth, and their daily routines. So there's an interconnectedness of what we do on a daily basis, who we are, and the different variables that affect our performance, whether it's a lack of sleep, you just had a large dinner, or you're preoccupied about stress and how that changes up your performance. The environment is a vital determinant of outcomes, and we have to modify our habits, roles, and routines. So the point here is that with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've definitely changed the way we operate on a day-to-day basis. It's important to have a balance is the key. So the balance really sets into what we define as a balance, how much time we allocate to ourselves and how much time we allocate to those we love, especially those with disabilities. And that's one of the barriers, is the allocation of time. Time is definitely precious, but it's much more important to allocate time when needed for individuals with disabilities versus not having enough time during a day. So the allocation of time in advance can definitely help in terms of your own level of endurance, but also the quality of care rendered to individuals with disabilities. Right, I believe we're on the last slide. There we go. Okay, key takeaways, everyone. Thank you so much for your time in today's presentation. It's a broad topic, I know, but I really definitely want to shed light into this unfortunately very underrepresented population within our society, especially within a chaotic time such as COVID-19. So individual disabilities are not the majority. They are a minority within our population, whether it's New York, the United States, or even from a global perspective. But their voices have to be heard, and they have to be in the party. They have to be in the conversation. They have to be in the hat. So advocacy is huge, and advocacy is not something that has to be politicized. It's speaking up. It's representing. It's speaking up for someone who may not be able to speak fully for themselves. So advocacy is in any form. Social health and sociocultural disparities continue to exist during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, lay individuals like me and you can definitely be encouraged to kind of take a micro level change and create a societal transformation of understanding that individuals with disabilities have to be represented within any public policy and any decision changes moving forward. Again, the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely shed some insight into what we can do better. Lastly, thank you so much. Last PowerPoint, I think I already mentioned. There's a QR code to great resources, credible resources. If you take out your mobile devices and use the camera feature to scan that code in front of the globe, you'll be directed to a CDC list of credible resources on a NYC local level. Great resources, great communities, especially great for individuals with disabilities and caregivers. All right, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Vikram. Well, we have a very, very lively chat, and I actually wanted to make sure I got, I know we had a couple questions planned, but I wanted to make sure I got some of the audience involved in our conversation today. And we actually just got a great question from Rebecca, who actually asked, virtual learning was really good for a lot of kids with social, emotional issues in the classroom. For this reason, should there be continued remote options for those students and for overall mental health?
Sure. I actually, as someone who's spent a lot of time in the public school system as an educator and as a clinician, absolutely. I think some of the lessons learned from COVID is that it has to be adapted in every situation. Within early of 2020, we often had to kind of rush and quickly adapt the online model across the board, but we didn't have enough time or resources to look at it from a very individualized level. So just to quickly provide an example, District 75, or the special education system of education, is different than general education. So the special education sector of public education requires much more thought into the delivery of the type of model that we're looking at, versus general education, it's a little bit more universal. So to answer that question, I definitely think it should be continued, but I definitely think as educators and as parents, we kind of have to make it more centralized to their needs. Yeah.
And what can we do to connect more on a communication level as far as stuff that's not verbal? And the reason I bring this up was we actually just got a great comment from Carissa. She says, my aunt and her friends take care of two nonverbal autistic boys, and they have to constantly remind them to keep their masks on. So I know you touched on this a little bit before with being able to not being able to read people's lips and things like that. What can we do from a conscious standpoint to make sure we're able to kind of connect on an emotional level?
Sure. Great question. I think to answer that, I would say to not have any assumptions. Again, an individual, whether it's a child or adult with autism, doesn't have a tattoo or label that says, I have autism, right? And we sometimes often assume that the way that we reciprocate language is universal. If you understand it, Nicholas, everyone else should be able to understand it. And that's not right. So from a caregiver perspective, especially for a child or children with autism, I think it's important to understand that the supplement of gestures, if I have my face covered, but if I'm able to express my needs through hand movements or body movements, or if I can try to fluctuate my tone, that's always a great tool to supplement what my message is, if it's not just verbal output. I found a lot of adults or a lot of teens with autism often tend to kind of mix different forms of communication. They'll use tactile gestures, meaning a pat on the back or a quick nod to kind of get your attention, versus saying, hey, Nick, or hey, Vic, and that works for them. So it's a combination of both. Yeah.
And I'd also like to know, what are some signs that we can see? I know you mentioned this earlier also in the presentation, when dealing with mental health and trying to pick up on some things that may not be spoken outright. What are some signs that we can look for if someone might be struggling as an effect of the pandemic?
Sure, sure. We're often told to look for inactivity, right? Or look, when they disappear from the game, right? When they're not talking, when individuals seem very distant, very unresponsive. But I also would argue that extreme behavioral fluctuations can also be signs of distress or signs of something that might be very wrong. And these behavioral fluctuations, sometimes the term is called manic, and sometimes having manic behaviors, we often use it as a slur, but in the medical community, having a manic disorder is a real disorder. But it's extreme fluctuations in mood, affect, emotions. As a quick example, a patient of mine, went from emotionally, in my opinion, having a very appropriate affect based upon the situation, to then having an emotional outburst within a second. Crying, tantrums, an inability to console themselves or cope with their emotions, almost like it just hit them very hard. And that to me is a sign of distress. Again, it might take you back a little bit, but it might also be a cry for help, especially when they can convey it in a understandable way.
And we actually just got another great question from Fauna as we get ready to close. She asked, having lived through the pandemic, have you learned anything new that will allow you to better prepare for, hopefully not, but if there is a pandemic in the future?
Where do I start? So many. I mean, there's like a whole list full. But to answer that question, I would say as a human being, to be more empathetic. I think we sometimes discount the power of empathy. So to be more empathetic, whether it's as a human being, as a friend, as a clinician, as an educator, even as an educator, I've learned that empathy goes a long way. It's much different than sympathy. Sympathy is a lot different than empathy in the case where you're trying to relate versus you're trying to feel sorry for someone, right? Which is, thanks for feeling sorry, but it doesn't really help me. So being empathetic is something that I've learned over the course of a year across the board as a professor, as a therapist, as a friend, and as a family member. So I think, demonstrating empathy or empathetic behaviors is a great way of showing respect and connectedness to those in front of you.
And just lastly, if you could kind of reach out to our audience and, give them, one piece of advice or, leave them with that one nugget, what would you kind of want them to know?
Remain accountable. You are accountable for yourself. You're accountable for your family, your loved ones, your friends, whoever you deem important in your life. But to remain accountable to those who really need support, whether it's passive, direct, or indirect. I think it's a great tool to remember that, again, we have to help each other out. A simple phone call does wonders. Even if you're not able to help or be accountable, finding someone who can be is just as good for those in need versus not doing anything yourself.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Vikram. And we want to thank everybody for joining us today. And again, this is being recorded and will be available roughly about 10 minutes after our conversation. So if you hopped on late or missed anything, please feel free to hop back on that same registration link and rewatch it. Again, thank you, Vikram. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and have a good and safe rest of your day.
Take care, everyone.